우리 모두는 탄수화물을 주식으로 삼으며 수십 년간 살아왔습니다. 키토 식단이 어렵게 느껴지는 가장 큰 이유는 우리가 거의 평생 사용해온 주 에너지원을 탄수화물에서 지방으로 전환해야 한다는 점 때문입니다. 물론 식단 구성의 변화도 낯설지만 이것을 하며 겪는 몸의 변화는 우리 모두에게 새로운 첫 경험입니다. 문제는 그 변화가 항상 긍정적이지만은 않다는 데 있습니다. 하지만 앞으로 나타나게 될 변화와 그 이유에 대해 미리 이해하고 있다면 막연한 두려움은 줄어들고 훨씬 편안한 마음으로 키토 식단을 이어나갈 수 있을 것입니다. 다만 이런 생리학적 기전을 혼자서 공부하고 이해하기란 쉽지 않은데요. 스탠 에크버그 박사는 이런 정보를 배경 지식 없는 일반인도 한 번에 이해할 수 있도록 쉽게 풀어내는 특별한 재능을 가진 전문가입니다. 그는 키토 식단 초기에 나타나는 몸의 변화에 대해 다음과 같이 설명합니다.
The first thing that's going to happen is you have to reduce your carbohydrates. You got to cut them down somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 grams per day. And we're talking net carbs, meaning you take the total number of grams of carbs, you subtract the grams of fiber, you end up with net carbs because fiber doesn't really count. And you can cut down the carbs, or you could do intermittent fasting or do both. That works the best. But if you're intermittent fasting, that's a period of time during the day, say 14, 16, 18 hours, where you're not eating anything. So obviously you're not eating any carbohydrate during that time either. If you have a fondness for foods like this, then figure out how to find some alternatives because these foods are not going to work on a ketogenic diet. The first thing that's going to happen in the very beginning is your body thinks it's been robbed. It thinks it's been robbed of fuel, and you've been training it for years or even decades to rely on carbohydrates. You've been feeding it carbohydrates, you've been topping off the blood sugar every couple of hours, and your body has adapted to that. Now when you cut out the carbs, it's like you're pulling out the rug from under it. Its entire existence has been turned upside down. And that's not a bad thing, but if it happens suddenly, it's kind of a shock to the body. So it doesn't know where to get the fuel in the short term. And as a result, you're going to have a certain number of symptoms, more or less severe. But they're going to be in the very beginning for a few days. And they're going to be things like fatigue and brain fog and insomnia maybe. You're going to find maybe some muscle cramps. Maybe you even get a rash. And all of this put together, people often call the keto flu. And it's not really a flu. You don't have the flu. It's not an infection. It's just a bunch of unpleasant symptoms because your body went into a state of shock. If you want to avoid this, then just do it slower. But if you do it quickly, just know that this can happen. And if you try to exercise, you probably find that you have no energy for that. You crash, you feel terrible. The good news though is that you'll have some quick weight loss. You lose 3 to 4 pounds right off the bat and you get excited. The thing to understand about all this, whether it's the bad stuff or the good stuff, is that it's temporary. It's an initial adaptation.
여기서 스탠 에크버그 박사는 불쾌한 증상을 감수하며 키토 식단을 빠르게 도입할지 아니면 그런 증상을 최소화하기 위해 천천히 진행할지를 구독자들의 선택에 맡겼습니다. 하지만 저는 우리 구독자분들께 절대 일반 식단에서 하루아침에 엄격한 키토 식단으로 넘어가지 말라고 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 굳이 몸이 감당하기 힘든 적응 과정을 세게 맞을 이유가 없어요. 피할 수 있는 불쾌한 증상이라면 최대한 피하는 게 현명합니다. 왜냐하면 그런 부정적인 몸의 피드백은 식단에 대한 확신을 무너뜨리고 포기하는 원인이 될 수 있기 때문입니다. 두통, 피로, 집중력 저하, 수면장애 같은 초기 증상들이 심해지면 누구라도 이렇게 생각합니다. 아, 키토는 나랑 안 맞는다. 나도 그거 몇 달 해봤는데 너무 힘들고 안 좋았다. 실제로 이런 부정적인 경험담의 상당수는 초기 적응 과정을 버티지 못하고 중간에 포기한 경우가 많습니다. 특히 인슐린 저항성이 심하고 지방 대사 능력이 떨어진 상태에서 탄수화물을 갑자기 끊어버리면 문제가 커집니다. 우리 몸은 평소 쓰던 포도당도 없고 지방도 제대로 못 쓰니까 결과적으로 대사적 기아 상태에 빠집니다. 키토 식단을 먹고 있음에도 몸은 마치 굶고 있는 것처럼 반응하는 거죠. 이때 나타나는 부작용은 음식량을 극단적으로 줄이는 저칼로리 다이어트와 유사합니다. 생리불순, 탈모, 체온 저하, 피로 모두 같은 원리입니다. 게다가 지방 섭취량을 급격히 늘렸는데 몸이 이를 제대로 활용하지 못하면 설사, 복부팽만, 속쓰림 같은 소화장애가 나타날 수 있습니다. 물론 건강한 사람이라면 이런 적응기를 비교적 빨리 통과할 수도 있습니다. 하지만 솔직히 말해서 다이어트를 결심한 사람 중에서 그렇게 건강한 사람이 얼마나 될까요? 대부분은 이미 대사적으로 크고 작은 손상이 있는 상태일 겁니다. 그런데도 많은 사람들이 키토를 시작할 때 자신의 몸 상태를 고려하지 않고 한 번에 탄수화물을 끊어버리는 엄격한 키토식에 심지어 간헐적 단식까지 동시에 시도하기도 합니다. 이런 무리한 선택의 배경에는 조급한 감량 욕심이 있습니다. 아무리 빨리 감량해도 유지하지 못하면 무슨 소용이 있을까요? 식단을 지속하지 못하면 그 다이어트는 무조건 실패합니다. 그래서 저는 이런 방법을 절대 권하지 않습니다. 그 대신 감량 속도에 대한 욕심은 내려놓고 이 식단에 적응하고 정착할 수 있도록 천천히 키토 식단을 도입하는 걸 추천드립니다. 예를 들어 하루에 한 끼만 탄수화물을 줄인 키토 식단을 진행하고 나머지 식사는 일반식을 유지합니다. 그리고 2, 3주 단위로 점진적으로 탄수화물을 줄여나가는 거죠. 이런 방식이 부작용을 최소화하면서 장기적으로는 성공할 확률이 훨씬 높습니다.
But if you stick to it, if you go from days into weeks, now these symptoms are going to change. They're going to get better. You'll find that you have more energy, you have more focus, more mental clarity. You start sleeping better, your hunger and your cravings go away. If you're a woman and you notice that your periods got more irregular or your PMS got worse in the very beginning, then you'll find that a few weeks into it, they'll probably get better again. Weight loss is kind of a give or take. It's going to work for some people, they get into a steady weight loss, but other people are going to have a little plateau right after those first few initial days. And as far as energy for exercise, you'll find that you have great energy for low intensity things like walking, but if you try some high intensity, chances are you're going to crash, that you don't feel so great if you try something intense. But your body keeps adapting. So if you stay with it for months, then these symptoms are going to go away. They're going to be very stable. So you find stable energy, you find that you have no cravings, you find that you get better sleep, women have less PMS than they did even before they started, and you'll find that now you have better energy for exercise than you did even before while you were eating carbs. And we're going to talk about this in some detail. Weight loss is going to be successful for most people. If your primary problem is insulin resistant, then for 80% of people at least, you're going to find a steady drop in weight. Some people are still going to have some stubborn weight, and these are people who have multiple issues. On top of insulin resistance, they probably have some leaky gut, some autoimmunity, multiple allergies, hypothyroid, inflammation, etc. So those are some of the symptoms that you can experience at first and how they probably will go away. But what is it actually that's happening inside the body that's responsible for those symptoms? Once you understand that, then you feel much more comfortable with this whole process. So the early changes in the first few days is that you're going to have some glycogen stores. Glycogen is the body's way of storing carbohydrate. We break down carbohydrate to glucose, then we reassemble it into glycogen, which can quickly be broken down back into glucose. And your body can store about 1 pound of glycogen, right? That's about 1 to 1.5 days worth of carbohydrate. But what you have to realize is that glycogen also binds water. That's why it's not a very efficient form of energy storage. That's why the body prefers to store fat long term. It stores a little bit of glycogen short term, but it's inefficient because for every pound of glycogen that you store, it also is like a sponge. It pulls about 3 to 4 pounds of water with it. And as you're burning through the glycogen, as you're using that up, this water is released and you go to the bathroom all the time for the first 2 days, and whoop-de-doo, you find that you lost about 4 to 5 pounds in the first 2 to 3 days, and you're ecstatic. And it feels good, you look at the scale, but realize that this is just water. And it's a good start, but it's temporary unless you stick to this and switch into fat burning. And when you start eating less carbohydrates, there is less reason for the body to make insulin. And that's going to be good for blood sugar and insulin resistance long term, but short term, insulin promotes sodium and mineral retention. So as insulin goes down, before your body has adapted, you're going to lose some minerals, and where minerals go, water goes. So you lose a little bit more water, but primarily the effect here is with the minerals, where you're going to notice some muscle cramps. That in the first few days, your muscles cramp up more, but what you got to do is you got to keep up on fluids, and you have to keep up on the sodium and some potassium, magnesium, and so on. As carbohydrates and glucose become scarce in the body, blood glucose goes down, the body tries to compensate with cortisol. So for a short time, there can be some instability in blood glucose and some extra cortisol. And when this happens at night before you're fat adapted, you'll probably find that your sleep is a little bit disturbed right in the beginning as well. But the biggest priority of all is to make sure that the brain has enough fuel to function. So for the first couple of days, as glycogen drops, as blood glucose drops, the body tries to compensate with cortisol. The cortisol promotes gluconeogenesis. And at first, it tries to make glucose from protein because that's the first thing available before we start burning fat. And it's going to have some amino acids in an amino acid pool. It's going to break down some tissues and maybe even a little muscle for the first day or two. But this is very short term because in a couple of days, the body is going to become fat adapted. It's going to upregulate fat burning, lipolysis, and part of the fat is called glycerol. The fat is stored as triglycerides. So as fat is burned, glycerol is liberated. The body can use that glycerol to make more glucose, and it stops relying on protein almost entirely. It's going to have some protein available because as we lose weight, we're going to break down some skin and there's going to be some dead cells and so forth that we can recycle as protein. But we're not going to have to waste muscle to do it.
여기까지 에크버그 박사가 언급한 변화들은 좋든 나쁘든 모두 일시적인 과정입니다. 그래서 이 초기 반응만 보고 이 식단이 나랑 잘 맞는다 안 맞는다를 성급하게 판단하지 않는 것이 좋습니다. 하지만 실제로 많은 분들이 이런 실수를 합니다. 키토 식단을 시작하면 처음 며칠간 체중이 적게는 2-3kg, 많게는 5kg 이상도 쭉 빠지는 경험을 하게 되는데요. 이때 와, 효과가 엄청 좋다 하고 흥분하게 됩니다. 그 페이스라면 쉽게 목표 체중에 도달할 것 같으니까요. 그런데 그건 말 그대로 몸에서 물이 빠져나간 것이지 체지방이 줄어든 게 아닙니다. 한 2주쯤 지나면 체중 감소가 멈추고 정체될 텐데요. 여기에 곧바로 불안해져서 이런저런 시도를 해보지만 별다른 효과를 보지 못하고 이내 포기하게 됩니다. 근손실 걱정도 사실 오해에서 비롯됩니다. 식단 초기에 인바디 수치를 재보면 근육량이 뚝 떨어진 것처럼 보일 수 있습니다. 그 이유는 근육 속에 저장된 글리코겐이 물과 함께 빠져나갔기 때문입니다. 인바디 측정에서 체수분은 근육량에 포함되기 때문에 수분이 빠지면 근육이 줄어든 것처럼 보이는 거죠. 하지만 근육은 만들기 어려운 것처럼 단기간에 그렇게 허무하게 몇 킬로씩 빠지지도 않습니다. 흔히 당신생합성이라고 하면 근손실을 먼저 떠올리게 되는데요. 우리 몸에서 근육은 생존에 필수적인 자산입니다. 그래서 정말 위급한 상황이 아니라면 꼭 필요한 근육을 녹여서 연료로 쓰는 일은 거의 없습니다. 대신 몸은 체내에서 불필요해진 조직, 죽은 세포, 단백질 찌꺼기 같은 잉여 자원을 우선적으로 사용합니다. 그러니 당신생 반응이 항상 근손실로 이어지는 것은 아닙니다. 집안에 벽난로로 불을 뗄 때 장작 대신 멀쩡한 소파를 부숴서 땔감으로 사용하지 않는 것처럼요. 우리 몸은 그렇게 비효율적인 짓을 하지 않습니다. 그리고 식단 적응 과정에서 나타나는 증상의 중요한 원인 중 하나는 바로 수분과 미네랄 부족입니다. 두통, 피로, 무기력, 수면장애, 근육경련, 이런 증상들은 대부분 수분과 전해질 부족에서 비롯됩니다. 인슐린은 혈당을 조절하는 역할 외에 나트륨 흡수를 하는 중요한 기능도 합니다. 키토 식단으로 인슐린이 줄어들면 나트륨과 수분이 빠져나가고 그와 함께 칼륨, 마그네슘 같은 전해질도 손실됩니다. 그래서 충분한 수분 섭취, 그리고 미네랄이 풍부한 소금을 충분히 먹거나 마그네슘 보충제를 활용하는 것만으로도 많은 초기 증상을 완화할 수 있습니다. 물론 같은 증상이라도 원인은 다양하기 때문에 이게 만병통치약은 아닙니다. 하지만 간단하면서도 초기 증상을 완화하는데 꽤 효과적이기 때문에 챙겨볼 만한 방법입니다.
And then of course the biggest change of all is that once we get into a state of ketosis as a result of our ketogenic diet, then the brain can run as much as 75% on ketones as an alternative fuel. And why is that important? Because if you're carb dependent, if you've only fed your body primarily carbohydrates, then it's dependent on that and maybe or probably insulin resistant. Now, even if you have a lot of glucose available, the brain can still be starving because the brain is also insulin resistant. And even though there's a ton of glucose circling around, it can't get into the brain. Ketones don't have that problem. So as you shift to ketone metabolism, you just provided your brain a whole bunch of extra fuel that's not dependent on insulin. And this is why a lot of people start feeling better. They get more energy, they have more clarity as soon as they have a few ketones kick in. Next, I want to talk about acetyl-CoA. And don't worry about the name, all right? We're going to make a lot of sense of this. It's going to look a little technical, but you're going to get so much out of it. I'm really excited here. Acetyl-CoA is a metabolic intermediary. It's a middle step in making energy in the body. So if we're running on glucose, we start off with glucose, then we split the glucose through a process called glycolysis, and in the end, as we chop it up, there's a bunch of steps missing, but we end up with a molecule called acetyl-CoA, and then we take that intermediary and we feed it into the energy machinery, all right? The TCA cycle. Don't worry about the name. It's inside the mitochondria. 95% of the energy in the body is made in the presence of oxygen through oxidation, and the fuel for that energy machine is called acetyl-CoA. And not only glucose can become acetyl-CoA, but all the fuel is acetyl-CoA as an intermediary, or the vast majority. So when we eat fat, then we start breaking down the fat molecule, we chop it up in little pieces through a process called beta oxidation. Different enzymes, but the same idea, and we end up with acetyl-CoA that we can feed into the energy machine. So this will explain why you can make fat from glucose but not vice versa. Because glucose to acetyl-CoA, the arrow only goes one way. It's irreversible. Once we break that glucose, it's not coming back the other way. And this is how glucose can become fat, but fat cannot become glucose again. And this is why the body makes ketones, because the body can use the glucose, but it can't use the fat. It can't break down fat into acetyl-CoA. So we need another intermediary. We need another mechanism, and this is where ketones come in. So again, it's about acetyl-CoA. The body takes now the acetyl-CoA from fat, from other tissues than brain, and it puts it together into ketones. And then it can take the ketones apart again into acetyl-CoA and make energy. And I wanted to demystify this to show you that the fuels are not that different. They're just different tissues can use them at different times. So it just packages the fuels differently so it can use them at the appropriate time.
아세틸코에이라고 하면 이름부터 어렵게 느껴질 수 있지만 쉽게 말하면 이것은 우리 몸이 에너지를 만들기 전에 거쳐야 하는 공통 연료 형태입니다. 이것을 전기에 비유해서 다시 한번 설명해 볼게요. 전기를 만드는 방법은 여러 가지가 있죠. 풍력, 태양열, 석탄, 원자력. 출발점은 다 다르지만 결국 발전소 안에서 한번 변환 과정을 거치면 전기라는 동일한 에너지가 만들어집니다. 우리 몸도 마찬가지입니다. 탄수화물을 먹든 지방을 먹든 연료의 종류가 달라도 결국 아세틸코에이라는 같은 형태로 변환된 뒤 TCA 회로라는 발전소 안에서 에너지를 만들어냅니다. 탄수화물이 부족하면 몸은 지방에서 아세틸코에일을 만들지만 일부 조직, 특히 뇌는 이 상태 그대로 사용할 수는 없습니다. 그래서 몸은 아세틸코에일을 케톤이라는 중간 연료로 바꿔서 전신에 공급합니다. 케톤은 뇌뿐만 아니라 근육, 심장, 신장 등 여러 조직에서 바로 연료로 활용됩니다. 특히 케톤은 인슐린에 의존하지 않고 세포 안으로 들어갈 수 있어 안정적으로 에너지를 제공합니다. 이게 바로 키토 식단에서 케톤체가 중요한 이유입니다. 탄수화물을 먹을 때처럼 혈당이 급격히 오르내리지도 않고 장시간 일정하게 에너지를 공급하기 때문에 식욕 조절이 훨씬 쉬워집니다. 키토 식단을 하면서 가장 크게 달라지는 점 중 하나가 바로 이 배고픔에 대한 조절 능력입니다. 이와 관련해 에크버그 박사는 이어서 설명합니다.
So many times you hear that carbohydrates is the preferred fuel or fat is the preferred fuel or this and that. But carbohydrates are only the preferred fuel if that's primarily what you give the body. The body is going to get used to it. It's going to adapt to using whatever you give it. If you gave the body nothing but alcohol, that becomes the preferred fuel. All right? It's not a good idea. Okay, don't say that I heard it from Dr. Ekberg. Okay, don't use alcohol as the only fuel. But the point is, if you give it fat only, it uses fat only. If you give it carbs only, it uses carbs only. The difference is fat is a stable fuel, glucose is an unstable fuel, and it messes with your metabolism, with your metabolic machinery over time. That's why a low-carb diet provides stability. It's a stable environment for the brain in the long run. But if you stay with this for months, now you have metabolic flexibility. You have flex fuel. You can shift from one fuel to the other and not miss a beat. Over time, as insulin is low, your insulin resistance goes down and your body shifts from a predominance of storing, from a tendency to store food into using food. You start rebuilding, you start healing your metabolism. As you become more insulin sensitive, you start breaking down more fat. You're promoting the usage, so you're breaking down fat through lipolysis. And another interesting thing is that your leptin starts working again. Leptin is a satiety hormone. When you eat food, leptin is released and it tells your body you're full. But when you're very insulin resistant, the leptin doesn't work. So you eat, your body releases leptin, but you keep eating anyway because you're leptin resistant. When insulin resistance dropped, now leptin starts working. So guess what? You get full. You have no hunger. As your body repairs and finds its balance, you can go for a long period of time and have no hunger. Of course, one of the major benefits of reducing insulin resistance is that you reduce metabolic syndrome. So your cholesterol imbalance goes away, your high blood pressure goes down, your type 2 diabetes reverses. Everything related to metabolic syndrome goes down because it is about insulin resistance.
키토 식단을 하면서 제가 느낀 가장 큰 변화 중 하나는 배고픔을 대하는 태도였습니다. 예전에는 배고픔을 거의 근손실의 신호처럼 여겼어요. 제때 먹지 않으면 곧바로 근육이 사라질 거라고 생각했고, 그래서 배가 고픈 상태를 절대 허용하지 않았습니다. 그런 강박 때문인지 배가 조금이라도 고프면 금세 예민해졌고, 아무거나 입에 넣으면서 뭐든 먹는 게 굶는 것보단 낫다고 생각했습니다. 하지만 키토 식단을 하면서 배고픔의 양상이 완전히 달라졌습니다. 우선 배고픔 자체가 훨씬 줄었고, 허기도 마치 파도처럼 한 번 밀려왔다 사라진다는 걸 알게 되었습니다. 그리고 한동안 먹지 않아도 몸이 충분히 잘 기능한다는 걸 배웠고, 직접 경험을 통해 확실히 느꼈습니다. 이 변화는 저를 자연스럽게 간헐적 단식으로 이끌었습니다. 감량을 위해서 억지로 한 게 아니라 그냥 배가 안 고프니까 한 끼쯤 건너뛰는 게 오히려 편하고 자연스러운 생활 패턴이 된 겁니다. 그런데 많은 분들이 키토 식단과 간헐적 단식을 세트처럼 묶어서 시작하는데, 사실 이건 득보다 실이 더 클 수 있습니다. 앞서 말씀드렸듯이 식단 초기에는 탄수화물 공급이 끊기고 지방 대사에도 아직 적응하지 못한 대사적 기아 상태에 빠질 수 있습니다. 이때 간헐적 단식까지 더하면 피로, 집중력 저하, 수면 장애 같은 부작용이 훨씬 심해질 수 있습니다. 물론 한 번쯤 억지로 참고 버텨보는 것도 좋은 경험이 될 수는 있습니다. 하지만 저는 간헐적 단식은 지방 대사에 충분히 적응한 뒤 배고픔이 자연스럽게 줄어든 시점에 도입하는 걸 권합니다. 이렇게 하면 간헐적 단식이 고통스러운 도전이 아니라 자연스러운 선택이 됩니다.
Now next is a question that so many people have. What about exercise? Don't I need carbohydrate to exercise? Because they've been told that you can do some aerobic long distance exercise on fat, but you need carbohydrates for high intensity exercise. So both of those are true. Now let's clarify how all that works. Because what you're going to find is that you'll actually have, months into this, you'll have more energy for both endurance and short burst activity. Here's a huge misconception about glycogen. We hear so often that you start off with a full glycogen store, and then as you go low carb, then your body is going to burn the glycogen because you're not eating anything, and it's going to go straight down to zero. And here's what they say. You're not going to make ketones, you're not going to burn fat until your glycogen is depleted, right? That's not how it works. Glycogen is a backup fuel. It's an emergency fuel. If you get chased by a wild animal, then there's going to be a short burst of activity. As you sprint away or as you climb a tree, there's going to be a need for more short-term energy than you can burn through fat oxidation. So in order for you to survive, you can't have zero glycogen. The body is not going to let that happen. The only time you may have seen zero glycogen is called a bonking. When someone is a long endurance athlete, like a marathon runner or a triathlete, and they're many, many hours into the event, and they just totally crash. When they just fall apart to the point where they can barely stand up. That is when you have zero glycogen. But that's hours into a race. Your body is not going to let that happen voluntarily. So here is what happens more likely, is that in the beginning it's almost a straight line, but as the body senses that we're starting to run out of this emergency fuel, then it's going to switch to fat metabolism, and it's going to start saving up on the little glucose that we have. So even on a carnivore, even on a very low carb diet, the body is going to start saving, and as the weeks turn into months, it's going to replenish this glycogen store, especially in athletes. If you use glycogen on a regular basis, the body is going to make sure that it has enough. And they found in recent studies that they looked at ultra marathoners, people who run more than one marathon at a time, and they compared a group of high carb and they compared a group of low carb, and they found that they had the same amount of glycogen before and after their activity, that they were very similar in behavior. Here was the main difference though. The high carb athletes are not going to be as good at utilizing fat. The low carb athletes had a more than twice as high peak burning of fat as the high carb. So as you switch to low carb, it might take several months to get fully fat adapted to that point, but eventually you can have a submaximal activity and burn 90% fat during that activity. So now you have the best of both worlds. You burn primarily fat on the submaximal activity, but through adaptation, you've taught your body to build up some glycogen stores, so you're burning fat, but you still have the carbohydrate backup. So this is why you can be both an endurance athlete and a high-intensity athlete on a low-carb or a ketogenic diet, but you'll never find out if it's going to work unless you stay with it for months. Because in a few days, you'll feel absolutely terrible. A few weeks into it, you'll probably still won't have that burst performance. But months into it, you're going to have the best of both worlds. So I really hope that you're starting to see how smart the body is, that there's nothing random about this, that the production of ketones, ketogenesis, is very highly regulated. Oftentimes they'll say flippantly that, oh, ketogenesis is simply a byproduct of fat. When you burn a bunch of fat, then ketones result. That's not how it is. The body makes it on purpose. A bear, for example, goes through maybe 100 or more pounds of fat in a 6-month hibernation and still makes virtually no ketones because they have the fuel supplied to the brain just from burning the fat. They have enough glycerol to make glucose because the brain is relatively small. Humans have a bigger brain, so we make it on purpose. And don't worry about these names, but when two signaling molecules called AMPK and glucagon go up, and at the same time glucose and insulin goes down, that signals scarcity. And that gives the body a reason to make ketones. And now if we're burning a lot of fat, then we're chopping up those fat molecules into acetyl-CoA and we reassemble them into ketones. But again, this is on purpose. And the reason is to provide more fuel for the brain because we have a huge brain in relation to the body size. And what's exciting is that recent research is showing us, as well as people's experiences, but it's showing us that this is not just a survival mechanism, but that the ketones in many ways is a superior fuel, especially if you're insulin resistant. Now you have a fuel for the brain that doesn't require insulin to get in there. And what most people are going to find out really quick, or at least weeks or months into it, is that now you have stable energy. Glucose and carb metabolism is very unstable. It fluctuates very quickly, so you have to top it off every few hours. You become dependent on frequent meals, whereas if you're fat adapted, you're making some ketones, now you have an almost endless fuel supply and your energy and your mood is very stable.
어떤 사람들은 키토 다이어트를 단지 탄수화물을 안 먹는 극단적인 식단이라고 말합니다. 하지만 이 영상에서 살펴본 것처럼 키토 식단은 새로운 것을 억지로 만드는 게 아니라 원래 우리 몸에 있던 또 다른 대사 방식을 활용하는 것 뿐입니다. 이 원리를 이해하면 키토 식단에 대한 막연한 두려움을 없앨 수 있습니다. 그리고 기억하실 점이 하나 또 있습니다. 케토시스 대사 상태는 불을 켜고 끄는 온오프 스위치가 아니라 불빛의 밝기를 조절하는 디머 스위치에 가깝습니다. 가령 빵 한 조각을 먹는다고 곧바로 키토 아웃이 되는 건 아닙니다. 그래서 필요에 맞게 다양한 형태로 응용할 수 있는데요. 탄수화물 섭취량에 따라 카니보어, 키토, 저탄수 식단으로 나눌 수 있습니다. 또 섭취 타이밍에 따라 운동 직전에만 탄수를 먹거나 일주일에 한 번은 탄수를 허용하는 방식도 있습니다. 일부 전문가들은 이런 변형을 좋아하지 않지만 저는 필요에 맞게 변형해도 괜찮다고 생각합니다. 결국 식단은 목표를 이루기 위한 도구일 뿐이고 그 결과가 우리를 더 건강하게 만든다면 그것이 가장 좋은 방식입니다. 오히려 각자의 상황과 건강 상태를 고려하지 않고 정해진 틀을 만들어 이건 키토가 아니다 라고 단정짓는 건 사람들에게 거부감만 줄 뿐입니다. 여러분의 몸은 생각보다 훨씬 유연하고 똑똑합니다. 식단도 그에 맞게 유연하게 선택하세요. 이상한 다이어트였습니다.